Pat Mayo, DraftKings NFL analyst. And with preseason now underway, DraftKings has this new set of NFL daily fantasy games ready to roll. In addition to the DraftKings Sportsbook, for those in the New Jersey, also some of the new stuff DraftKings is presenting this year is Flash Draft. You'll be able to draft a fantasy team in the middle of the game before the second quarter. Also, Team Pick'em gives people the opportunity to pick the winners of single NFL matchups and win cash, just like any other daily fantasy contest through DraftKings. And joining us, like we said, Pat Mayo on the Boardwalk Honda hotline. Pat, how you doing on this Wednesday?
I'm doing good. Pumped about these new DraftKings games.
So let's first touch on the Flash Draft. I mean, that in and of itself is a very interesting concept. The game is already underway, and people have an opportunity to draft the team when the game's already started. So touch on that.
So basically, it's going to be set up a lot like the tiered structure system. So you have your classic DraftKings salary cap where you play the entire slate or a minimized slate. You have the tier pick'em where there's a bunch of tiers. They give you a list of players, and you choose from those. Then you have the showdown contest, which is just a single game only, but it's also salary cap. So this is basically merging that showdown slate and the tier slate into a single quarter slate for each individual game. So you go through the lobby, you see the lightning bolt, you get into the Flash Draft, and you can pick whatever game that you want, but only the one game. So you can break it down by second quarter, second half, third quarter, and fourth quarter. So when you get into the game, you'll immediately see how long you have left until the next draft actually occurs. So if you're halfway through the first quarter, you go into the system, and you'll get push notifications on the DraftKings app every time that you go through it. But it'll say like 8 minutes left until the next draft. So you go in, and it's a 5-tiered process. So you make 5 picks. You have 15 seconds to make each pick, and you're given 3 options to choose from. So, for example, let's say we took a Miami-New England game, and the first 3 picks, you'd have 15 seconds to choose between the second quarter stats of, let's say, Kenny Stills or Rex Burkhead, or even a combination of players like, let's say, Malcolm Mitchell and Philip Dorsett together as one. There's even multipliers for some of the players. So, for example, in that scenario, someone like Rex Burkhead might actually get double points for every rushing yard that he gets. All the projections, at least going into the quarter, are about the same, so you have the chance to go through. And even within that actual slate app, you can find out the running stat totals from the game. You can follow along play-by-play. Basically, you can break it down quarter by quarter, get your instant action in, and then you can go back at it again for the third quarter if you want. But you can also follow along with the games and the stats within the very same screen.
And you mentioned follow along with the game. Also, the Team Pick'em is a great opportunity for people to, while they're playing daily fantasy on DraftKings, they can also run through the slate and pick some games they're already following.
Yeah, exactly. It's a giant free contest offered up by DraftKings, tons of money to be given away, and you just go onto the site. It's a lot for, the most advanced players will play it, the biggest beginners will play it, and it's just straight up pick 'em. So you can go onto the site, you make your picks for the slate. Week 1 only has 15 games. Sorry, Eagles fans, there's no Thursday nighter in the very first one, but after that, it'll be the full collection of games. So you'll have your 16-game slates for weeks 1 through 4. Then we start getting into buys, and you get your 14-game slates, your 13-game slates. Then we're back to 16 by the end of the year. And you can make your picks up until that time that game starts. You can randomize your picks if you don't have the highest degree of confidence, but you can always change them and update them as they go along, and you'll be able to see your score for the week. You'll see yourself up against the masses in terms of the weekly leaderboard. Plus, there are separate weekly contests which are paid out after the final game of that week. But there's also a running season-long contest, and there's prizes for both. Again, completely free to enter.
You mentioned the Eagles. I'm glad you transitions to my next question. So, from a fantasy football perspective, whether it's daily fantasy or for the season, you look at the Eagles quarterback situation, Pat. You got Carson Wentz. He may or may not start week 1. If he doesn't start, the expectation would be Nick Foles. So from your perspective, how do you recommend people handle that? Do you treat Nick Foles as a handcuff for Carson Wentz, or do you look at Carson Wentz and say, look, he may only miss 1 or 2 weeks. I'm going to draft him no matter what and treat him like a starter for the season?
Well, Carson Wentz is the one really interesting example because most of the Eagles players from a fantasy perspective aren't that great, simply because Doug Peterson has a great ability to mix and match players for different schemes against different defenses and uses them as a team concept, a great real-life team. But in terms of fantasy, like, hey, Jay Ajayi might get 20 carries one game, then all of a sudden Corey Clement's used around the goal line, that they spread the wealth out so much that it's hard to pinpoint what exact player during what exact game is going to do anything. Wentz is really the exception, though, so I don't care. He can miss the first 4 weeks. For all I care. I have him rated as my number 6 quarterback overall coming into the season. And the benefit is everyone's so scared about drafting an injured player that he keeps falling down draft boards. I did a draft over the weekend. He went into the 12th round, which is nuts. And maybe he doesn't play week 1. Big deal. The first 4 weeks of the season, there are no bye weeks. There is no easier position to recover from in fantasy than quarterback. You can go pick up a guy for one game off the waiver wire at quarterback, and then all of a sudden you're coming back to Carson Wentz. And even if he doesn't put up the same numbers as last year, let's say he's limited on the ground to protect the knee right when he first comes back, he's still going to be a very high-end option, an elite option at quarterback. So the draft capital only makes sense to take him.
Pat, you mentioned the Eagles kind of spread the wealth, and I mean, that's why they basically won the Super Bowl last year. They had so much talent at every single position. But when you're talking from a fantasy standpoint, you mentioned Wentz as an exception. I want to throw Zach Ertz at you. I know they like to use a lot of 2 tight end sets, and now they drafted Dallas Goedert. They still have Richard Rodgers behind them as well. But Zach Ertz has emerged as one of the top tight ends in the NFL, and also pretty much fantasy-wise as well. Would you put Zach Ertz in that top tier for tight ends and maybe overall weapons to utilize in fantasy this year?
Yeah, I mean, overall weapons in fantasy might be stretching it a bit because only peak Gronk at tight end can really breach into that level because of the upside that he possesses in that offense. You have to think about Zach Ertz in a couple different ways. I have him ranked 3 in both my PPR rankings, which is point per reception, and non-PPR, which doesn't count catches. He's far more valuable in a points per reception format. He's really close to Gronk and Kelsey in that sort of scoring because you know that his target share in this offense is basically the one guy in the receiving game who doesn't disappear week to week. And God forbid anything happened to Ertz, Goddard would easily become a top 5 tight end in that situation, almost like whenever Trey Burton would get thrust into a starting role, that all of a sudden he was just scoring touchdowns every week. The problem is when we think about overall ceiling in terms of yardage, the way that Ertz is used, he'd have to score so many touchdowns well above his career rate in order to compete with Kelsey and Gronk from a yardage perspective. So when you throw in points per reception in there, it closes the gap, and he is a part of that very top tier. In just standard scoring, he's still number 3, but he's not quite as close to the top 2.
It's interesting you mentioned Dallas Goedert along with Zach Ertz, and they're going to use a lot of 2 tight end sets this year. But do you really think Dallas Goedert is automatically a top 5 talent fantasy-wise? Should Ertz, God forbid, go down with an injury? I mean, what do you see out of Goedert? Is it the Eagles' offense? Is it Peterson? Is it Wentz? I mean, what makes Goedert that valuable in fantasy should Ertz go down?
It's the role, and it's what we saw with Trey Burton last season. Now, I happen to think that, the reason that you draft Goddard and let Burton walk, yeah, there's the price that's included in how much Burton ended up going for, but I don't think there's a huge skill disparity between the two. Obviously, Burton's far more seasoned, and he was acclimated with that offense. The whole thing is that the tight end has a specific role in Doug Peterson's offense. So if you take out Ertz and you make Goddard tight end 1, because I do not think it's going to be Richard Rodgers by any stretch of the imagination, it's going to be Goddard, that all of a sudden the target share that was going on to Ertz almost immediately transfers over to Goddard. So in that situation, you take out, and there's going to be certain circumstances where Goddard, scores a touchdown and leaves Ertz off as a decoy. In this other situation, everything goes through Goddard. So you still have to, play with somewhat of the downside that maybe he's not quite as talented as Ertz, which he's not, at least right now. But he's going to have enough volume to overcome that, and that's the hardest thing at tight end. There are so few tight ends that are actually focal points of their team's offense and get consistent work week to week, projectable volume that we can really bank on. And no matter who the tight end 1 is in the Eagles system, it's always incredibly valuable.
Pat, when you look at the upcoming rookies that are coming into the league, a lot of questions are always asked to me about who's a guy I can look for that I can kind of get in the later rounds that people don't really know. Last year was a guy like Dalvin Cook, albeit the injury. This year, I told a lot of people it was Darius Geis. Unfortunately, last week, he tore his ACL. Who is the guy that you're looking at, specifically the rookies, that could be that type of sleeper that you can get in the later rounds?
Right now, it depends on the draft that you're doing. There's so much buzz out of Denver about Royce Freeman that when we watched the first preseason game, he was backing up Devontae Booker. But Devontae Booker, realistically, has been given 3 shots to be the starter in Denver. It's never worked out, and maybe that's not his problem. He was dealing with a banged-up offensive line the past 2 years. Just think about the quarterbacks that they had last season. The fact they bring in Case Keenum, who people are kind of out on, but the one thing that people can agree on in terms of Case Keenum is that he's substantially better than anyone who played under center for Denver last season. So maybe that opens up a few more running lanes. But you go into the draft, you take Royce Freeman. There's already buzz at a Broncos camp with the media that he's eventually going to be the starter on this team. Whether it's week 1, who knows? But it could very well be week 2 or week 3. And then you're getting a workhorse back, someone who plays 60 to 65% of the snaps, sees around 18 to 22 touches a game, in an offense which, with a competent quarterback, should be markedly improved this season. And you have a good defense to back it up, that you're forced into a lot of running situations, either with marginal leads or in very close games, not situations where you're getting waxed and have to throw the ball 49 times a game. So Royce Freeman right now stands out to me. I mean, obviously Barkley is number 1 in that sense among rookie running backs, but Freeman would be my number 2. That's ahead of like Sony Michel. We saw Elijah Penny end up with this hand injury that might keep him out for week 1. Ronald Jones is struggling in pass protection in Tampa. Freeman is the one who looks like he has a clear path to taking over that job in Denver.
Pat Mayo joining us on the Boardwalk on the hotline on 97.3 ESPN, DraftKings NFL Analyst. Again, you can play the flash drafts as well as Team Pick'em this year on DraftKings.com and the DraftKings app. Pat, a couple more before we let you go, and I appreciate your time here on a Wednesday. A lot of questions about, people look at who you should take if you're doing a seasoned fantasy draft in the top 5, and there's some contention. Who is a better value at this point? Is it a Le'Veon Bell or is it Antonio Brown? Both guys have been great PPR guys for fantasy players for the last couple of years. But for you, if you're playing a season and you got a top 3 pick, are you considering Bell or Brown a greater value?
For me, it's Bell, only because running backs are worth more. And if you can get them healthy, and this comes down to pure PPR format. Now, Brown is also enhanced there, but Le'Veon Bell is one of the few running backs that's going to see a substantial upgrade, averaging around 7.5 targets per game. That's not going anywhere. Plus, he's not going to be back in Pittsburgh next season. They're going to run him into the ground. When we think about running backs that play over 90% of their team snaps, there's one. It's Le'Veon Bell. So when you try to project out any player in football, you project volume. And he is the one who's going to end up with the most touches. It's going to be him, Todd Gurley, or David Johnson. So in order, it goes Gurley, Bell, David Johnson. Those are the top 3 picks, regardless of scoring. And then Antonio Brown would come in at number 4.
Pat, it's interesting you actually bring that up between Antonio Brown and Bell, who has a better value. It seems like at a certain point a couple of years ago, the top of every draft, any fantasy draft, at least that I've been a part of, the receivers, Antonio Brown, Julio Jones, DeAndre Hopkins, Odell Beckham Jr., those were the guys who were taken with that first overall pick through, pick 4 or 5, and then you start seeing the running backs fall when it used to be always running back first, then you go maybe quarterback, wide receiver. Is there some sort of shift in fantasy drafting now? I mean, is it going back to the running back is the most valuable position and you take him first? Or do you see it kind of staying the same with running back, receivers? It's based on personal preference.
Well, the big thing is I'm a big proponent. Like, if you wanted to take Antonio Brown at number 1, I would have 0 issues with that. He's obviously a top-tier player. He's the best receiver. Having the best player at any position is always incredibly valuable. But to speak to your point, it did shift away from the running backs early into wide receivers, and that kind of came to a head last season because, Odell Beckham goes down in week 2, and boom, that pick is gone. And even the running backs that got drafted in the first round, none of them really got injured last season. So it's a recency bias in the back of people's mind. And if you can guarantee that whatever running back that you take in the first round ends up playing 16 games, you always take the running back, because the advantage that you would have with the top 10 running back over, let's say, like the 30th ranked running back is so gigantic. But by and large, wide receivers are safer. So in my rankings, I have those top 3 guys, like I mentioned, Gurley, Bell, David Johnson. And that's mainly because they're pass-catching specialists within their offense. That's why Zeke is nowhere to be found as a part of that. The guy, if he sniffs 50 catches, it's going to be incredible. You can pencil him for more like 35, 40, which is less than half of what the other guys are going to get. So after that, for me, I go Brown, I go DeAndre Hopkins, and I go Odell Beckham Jr. So I'm still on board with drafting wide receivers heavy. It's just those three running backs stand out from an overall volume perspective that when I project out their points, they're just so much higher than everybody else.
Pat Mayo is DraftKings NFL analyst. You can follow him on Twitter at the PME. That's the PME on Twitter. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, DraftKings new set of NFL daily games rolling in for 2018. You got the flash draft. You can draft after the game has even started, along with Team Pick'em as well. Pat, appreciate your time here on a Wednesday, and hopefully everyone takes your advice and has good fantasy seasons.
Yeah, if you take my advice and it turns out to be wrong, don't blame me.
Don't at me, right?
Exactly.
Pat, appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on.